So what are the dates of the Baroque period? Everybody should be able to say this together. What are the dates?
1600, 1750.
The reason that this year is chosen is because the first opera was written in 1601. And this year is the year that Johann Sebastian Bach died. So it's a 150-year period that saw lots of new things that developed. And so the most important aspect having to do with the birth of this new genre, opera, had to do with a philosophical approach to the purpose of music. There were a group of intellectuals and philosophers, musicians in Florence, Italy, who encouraged each other and came up with just the basic idea that then became really popular and spread eventually throughout Italy. And that was that music should serve the purpose of expressing the meaning of a text. And so what that is in contrast to is the Renaissance style of polyphony, in which all the voices were independent and therefore were not lined up metrically. So you had a text that was being expressed, but it was in this complicated layered texture, and it made it hard to understand the words that they were singing. And so what the Florentine Camerata, they returned to the ideals of the Greeks. So that was the number one purpose, was that music served this idea of expressing the meaning of a text. And so what this led to then was a type of texture that we've already talked about, which was called monody. So monody is a very dramatic and expressive texture that features a single melody line. And that would be accompanied. And it was accompanied by a pair of players that were called a continuo, that would realize a figure-based notation. So you start to see this style of writing occur at the end of the 16th century. And you see this in secular works. And one of the most important composers, if not the most important, that was a transitional composer from the Renaissance style to the early Baroque was Monteverdi. And Claudio Monteverdi wrote the first great masterpiece of opera, which is his work Orfeo in 1607. But with Monteverdi, you can see that he wrote madrigals, which were types of secular songs that were Italian texts. And he had the first 4 books were in the first practice, which he called the first practice, which was the Renaissance style, the polyphonic style. But then he also had another set of books that were in the second practice, which was in this new monodic style. So you can see with Monteverdi's work in that transition from the Renaissance to the early Baroque. What this did was to then bring attention to chord progressions because of the figured bass notational style. And so composers then started to view music in terms of not just melody, but also harmony. Yes?
So is this just a more specific form of homophonic?
It is, yeah. It's a more specific, yeah. So one melody line plus accompaniment. And you typically are thinking in terms of this being a vocal line. And you typically think of this being figured bass notation. So it was associated with writing for singers. And so these composers started to think in terms of chords, triads and seventh chords, and this was the beginning of the tertian harmonic style then, that was what was common in the common practice period among the composers of the Baroque, classical, and romantic. So who was the theorist who then wrote that landmark work that described tertian harmony and the idea of triads and seventh chords and chords in inversion and so forth? Rameau, right. So Rameau was the composer. I mentioned that at the beginning of the semester. And so this is one really important feature of the Baroque style, just has to do with the idea of harmony and of composers thinking in terms of harmonic progressions. Also at the same time then, composers started to just write in either major keys or minor keys. And so you don't have the use of church modes anymore. So the Renaissance and earlier is viewed as a modal era as far as the way that composers were viewing the construction of scales. So tonal just then implies this idea of writing in either a major key or a minor key. And these were two of the church modes, the Ionian mode, which is major scale, and then Aeolian, which is the scale from A to A, which is the natural minor scale. And so it was those two that they focused on in the Baroque period. And so that's what you're used to now with common practice period music. All right, so some other ideas from the Baroque. This term doctrine of affections is a very important concept. And this is something that the Baroque style was based upon. Affections means emotions. And so the idea is that music is very powerful and that music elicits an emotional response in the listener. And then further, the aesthetic sensibility was that a composer should only present one emotion per movement. So that is something then that really gives Baroque music a sense of unity, because you don't have contrasting A theme and B theme. You just have one thematic idea. So that's just a basic concept. There is a German term that describes the idea of continuous thematic development, and that is this term, Fortspinnen. Which means spinning forth. And so that has to do with continuous thematic development. By nature, that style is very sequential. And so you start to have that idea of just lots and lots of sequencing that's going on. So what was the idea of sequencing? So what does sequencing have to do with? So it's a term I could ask you, we talked about that. So it's just presentation of a melodic idea on different pitch levels consecutively. All right, so that's something that that you'll notice in this first example that we're going to listen to, which is the Bach-Brandenburg Fifth. All right, another term that you should have is the term continuo. The continuo is the two players who realize figure-based notation. So figure-based notation is something that's basic to the Baroque style, and that you'll see in all different types of genres. So the 17th century, you see a huge increase in the amount of instrumental music that's written. And so that means that composers are writing for specific combinations of instruments. They have a specific timbre in mind. Instruments in the Renaissance were very often used, but they would be used to double vocal parts, and it wasn't always specified exactly what instruments should be used. Just whatever was at hand could be used to double a vocal line, just give it more sound. So the continuo would always have a keyboard player. The keyboard player would play the bass line that's notated with the left hand, and then with the right hand would improvise a chord progression that's based on then the intervals that are indicated in the figure bass that sound above that bass line. And so it will tell you exactly what chords it should sound. So that use of continuo is something that was the practice in the Baroque period, and we'll see that then disappear at the beginning of the classical period. That composers then no longer use that style of writing, but instead they write out all the parts, so it's obligato. And so one thing that this then implies is the keyboard player is then improvising a chord progression that's based on the figured bass notation. And so there were different good solutions to that. But the general idea of improvisation is something that's basic to the Baroque style. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So you had two players. One was the keyboard, and then the second player was typically like a cello, maybe a bassoon. And that player would double the bass line, play the same line that the left hand of the keyboard was playing. All right, so that's what this term continuo refers to, are the players that realize that figured bass notation. So the Baroque style had lots of improvisatory features to it. So that's one, is this term realization just means to, make evident, to, perform then the figured bass. So you use that term realization. And that involved improvisation. You also have improvisation in the use of ornamentation. So there was a big vocabulary of ornamentation that arose in the Baroque period. And it varied from country to country, so there was a different set of symbols in France than what would be used in Italy or Germany. And so composers would write these into the music, but the performer also had the discretion of embellishing the line at their, according to their taste. So one example of this is in the performance of keyboard suites. Suites were collections of dances, and dances were written in binary form, which was a two-part form that had repeat signs for each of the parts. And so on the repeat of each part, then, especially in the slower movements, the performer would add extra embellishment of that. And again, that's something that wasn't notated in the score. It was something that was a performance practice.